Joe Rogan recently welcomed Christian scholar and apologist Wes Huff to his podcast for a 3-hour discussion on Christianity and the Bible. This was my first time hearing Wes Huff, though I did later discover that we actually already followed each other on X, so that's pretty neat. In any case, I was really impressed by Wes's knowledge of history, languages, and biblical manuscripts. Given that Rogan's podcast is the most popular podcast in the world, millions of people had the chance to hear about the evidence for the resurrection and the reliability of the Bible, so overall a huge win. Naturally, Wes's appearance on Rogan has sparked a lot of discussion. Many people, including many Christians, have offered valuable critiques of certain points that Wes made. Personally, I'm reluctant to critique Wes. I mean, he did a 3-hour-long unscripted interview and did an outstanding job overall. He did far better than I could have managed, for sure. So any critique that I might have feels a little trivial in light of his great performance overall. Seriously, it's a wonderful episode, and I highly recommend everyone check it out. Having said that, I do want to highlight a great point that Wes made about the Sabbath and the Law of Moses. Obviously, this is a topic that I'm passionate about, so I was excited to hear it brought up on the podcast, and I think Wes makes an important point here that I want us to consider.
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of. This is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like, Jesus critiques them for that because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So one of the things he says is like, if your donkey falls in a ravine on the Sabbath, do you pull it out? Or does that work? Like, what's the point of the Sabbath? Is it to not do any work? Like, is it to make sure that you're not working too hard because you might be breaking the Sabbath? Or like, what is the point? And he says, like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that there's this intention. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, is he keeps saying, you have heard it said, but I say, and he refers to the Mosaic Law. And it looks like he's critiquing the Mosaic Law, but he's not actually. He's getting back to the intention of the law. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you?
So Wes highlights an important point here. He says that Jesus is not critiquing the Mosaic Law in his Sermon on the Mount or during his confrontations with the Pharisees over Sabbath observance. This is important because way too many people want to say that Jesus is disregarding or contradicting the Law of Moses in these passages. However, in Matthew 5:17, Jesus explicitly commands us not to think that he came to do that. He did not come to abolish the law and prophets. Instead, he came to fulfill them. And in this context, the term fulfill, plerao, carries the sense of bring to full expression or show it forth in its true meaning. This aligns nicely with Wes's observation that Jesus did not critique the law. Instead, he came to bring out the true intention of the law. For more on Matthew 5:17-20, see my short book, How Jesus Fulfilled the Law. So, how does this apply to the Sabbath? Well, after establishing in Matthew 5:17-20 that he came to fulfill the law by teaching and showing the true intention of the law, later in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus brings out the true intention of the Sabbath. In Matthew 12, the Pharisees accuse Jesus' disciples of, quote, doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath, after witnessing his disciples pluck heads of grain. Jesus also faces criticism from the Pharisees for performing a healing on the Sabbath. Now, some interpreters see these conflicts as evidence that Jesus abolished the Sabbath, but they actually demonstrate the opposite. In both conflicts, Jesus does not reject the Sabbath, but instead upholds it, declaring his disciples innocent of the Pharisees' accusations and insisting that his own actions were, quote, lawful. As New Testament scholar J. Andrew Overman writes, quote, Jesus and his disciples do not break the law. They break with the Pharisees over interpretation of the law, but not with regard to its validity or importance. In Mark's account of the grain field incident, Jesus uses this confrontation with the Pharisees to explain God's intention for the Sabbath from the beginning. This is the verse that Wes quoted in his interview with Rogan. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What does this mean? Well, Jesus is saying that God's intention for the Sabbath is to bless mankind, an intention that Jesus upholds through his acts of mercy and healing on the Sabbath. The Pharisees, on the other hand, failed to uphold this intention in their teachings by neglecting human well-being and the weightier matters of the Torah. Jesus' focus on restoring the Sabbath to its true and original intention is precisely what we would expect of someone affirming the Sabbath's continued relevance. But it is not what we would expect from someone who believed that the Sabbath is no longer important. Amid these conflicts, Jesus declares that he is, quote, Lord of the Sabbath. While some people interpret this statement as Jesus appealing to his own authority to justify disregarding the Sabbath commandment, that interpretation renders Jesus' detailed legal argumentation in the previous verses entirely unnecessary and redundant. Instead, Jesus' claim here reinforces his biblical defense of himself and his disciples. As Stephen Stiles explains, quote, Jesus has engaged in first-century halakha concerning what is permissible on the Sabbath, but on account of his special status as the Son of Man, he declares his ruling to be the correct approach to the Sabbath. By claiming lordship over the Sabbath, Jesus declares that he has the ultimate authority to determine what Scripture says about how to keep the Sabbath. Jesus fulfills the Torah by teaching and showing what true Sabbath observance looks like and corrects the errors of the religious leaders of his day who misunderstood the Scriptures. Once again, if Jesus wanted to nullify or abolish the Sabbath, he would not have focused on clarifying what activities were, quote, lawful on it. Instead, Jesus' concern for proper Sabbath observance is consistent with what we would expect from someone who believed that the Sabbath was important and who wanted to ensure that his followers observed it correctly in accordance with the law of Moses. I think Wes's comments about the intention of the law are spot on. This is what Jesus said he came to do. He did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the Sabbath. He came to reveal their true intention. And this insight invites us to explore what that means for us today. What does it mean to live out the true intention of the Sabbath, for instance? Well, we can say that true Sabbath observance includes prioritizing human well-being, since the Sabbath is made to bless humanity. We can also say that it means doing good, since Jesus says that doing good on the Sabbath is, quote, lawful. So those are a couple of ways that we honor the intention of the commandment. And by the way, Jesus here is simply echoing the Hebrew prophets like Isaiah, who likewise tied Sabbath observance to matters of justice and righteousness. We can also say what the true intention of the Sabbath does not mean. As we saw, it does not mean that we are free to disregard the Sabbath. Jesus' teachings and attitude toward the Sabbath do not give us that option. Just as Jesus' teaching against harboring hate in your heart does not negate the literal commandment against murder, Jesus' teachings on the Sabbath do not negate the literal commandment to rest and abstain from work. Jesus' teachings bring out the deeper intention or principle of those commandments, but they don't replace them. Jesus' explanation of what is allowed on the Sabbath does not imply that anything and everything is allowed. Now, I suspect that Wes and I probably disagree on the specific parameters of what Sabbath observance looks like for Christians today, and that's fine. I'd welcome the chance to discuss this topic with him anytime, but what his insight on Joe Rogan provides, I think, is a much better starting point for that discussion. The debate is not about whether the Sabbath applies. We should all agree that it does. Instead, it is about how it applies. That is the question we should be asking. Personally, I'm convinced that God's intention for the Sabbath includes the expectation that we literally rest on the seventh day in accordance with the commandment. That is what Jesus and the apostles did, and in my view, the New Testament does not support the notion that this expectation has changed. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing, be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There, you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos, learn more about the books that I've written, and subscribe to my newsletter to ensure you never miss an update. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.